good evening. It's a real honor and privilege and pleasure to have Sadanand Menon with us in Puducherry. First, a small token of a few publications done of works from Puducherry. He's one of those few cultural critiques which I think is a very necessary thing in our country. So it's not just like an art critique but a cultural critique, am I right? So today I've just told him, please come, see the show and interact with us. So now the ball is in your court and we wait for you to tell us how we can go about this. I'm going to be part of the audience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kirti. And I'm also coming to Puducherry now after probably 2 years. I was a frequent visitor earlier, and there are some people here, old friends of mine, Janine from Chennai days, almost 35 years ago, and so on. There are many other friends in Puducherry, but for some reason, the traffic towards Puducherry has decreased for me, so I have been coming very often. But on and off, I have been in touch with friends here who are also artists and who are also creative people. I also used to write quite a lot about the French Institute's work when I was a practicing journalist in those days. But now, like you were saying, my area of work has shifted a bit. It's gone more towards teaching and pedagogy. Yeah, so like I said, I did have some familiarity with what was happening in Puducherry in the creative sphere, but I think in the last roughly 5 or 8 years, there has been a tremendous change in Puducherry itself, and the idea of art and expression has grown, and there are more local arts colleges, and there is more activity, more training in art, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, probably about 15 years ago, the one-stop destination for anyone coming to Puducherry was the Golden Bridge Pottery and meeting Ray and Delhi and going away. And Puducherry has become, for some strange reason, the studio potter capital of India in one sense. Every second person you meet is on the wheel and doing things. So that's fascinating and it's fantastic the way it's grown. But now with people like Kirti and this kind of a gallery that's come up here, it's unique. I mean, you don't have a space like this in Chennai, certainly, which has so many multiple layers and levels, and there's a particular attitude towards showing work which is very, very special. What kind of art is Puducherry producing in reference to the context, meaning in reference to say Tamil Nadu, in reference to Chennai, in reference to the rest of the country, in reference to what's happening in Delhi and Mumbai, and how does one look at this, and is that kind of a comparison even possible, or is it even necessary? So these are all questions that come up, because in the Indian context today, art seems to have really gone through the ceiling. There's a tremendous explosion of people who are experimenting with medium, with the material, with the approaches, and in fact, if you go to an average exhibition in Delhi, I think in Delhi is like the art capital of the country today. There are over 124 galleries in Delhi, and every second day there is an opening. And I would say, from what I've seen, about 80% of artwork has almost turned digital art. So there's something happening out there. People are working with new technology, new media, and this kind of an idea of a canvas and painting seems to have receded. This was the high point of modern art in India in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. Painting on canvas was considered the high thing. Sculptors were not considered very high, and ceramists were not considered very high. and anybody who worked in other media were not considered. So there was a hierarchy in art production, and painting and canvas oils particularly was considered the high point of artistic expression. And today suddenly you find, except for the old masters, people like say Ram Kumar or Krishan Khanna, old masters who established their genre on canvas, almost no newcomer is, no graduate from say College of Art in Delhi or Baroda or wherever is working with canvas anymore, or paint or oil paints anymore. So this very remarkable shift to a different realm, a different way of expression, to what could be called conceptual art, to looking at art not as a craft production, not as an act of skill, but as an act of thought and imagination. So that shift is very fascinating to see. And we had, what we did last year, year before last, and slipping into last year, we had this extraordinary Biennale in Cochin, India's first Biennale, the Cochin Biennale. And in Cochin Biennale, everybody remarked upon the fact that out of 94 artists who were presented there, 90 artists worked with electronic, digital, video material. And so, so something is happening in the world of art, a change of perception almost. So it's not necessarily the producer of the art, the receiver of the art, the viewer is also simultaneously changing. You're attuning yourself to a new reality. So therefore when I come in here and when I see this, it takes me back to a time which was probably 15, 20 years ago when this kind of art was seen all over India, and this kind of idea of expression was seen all over India. And today, how rapidly that scene has changed is quite fascinating for me. And I had recently, I have a space in Chennai. It's called Spaces. It's right on the beach. Janine knows that place very well. It was jointly created by one of my dear friends, Chandra Lekha, who was a legendary dancer and choreographer. Jean also knows him very well and very well. She passed away in 2006. But Chandra Lekha and my colleague Darshat Patel, whose film I'm going to show now, and myself, we created that space from scratch. It was right on the beach. It was only sand when we came there in 1979-80. But over the last 30-35 years, a lot of trees have come up and a lot of performance spaces have come up, and it's a very comfortable space now. All the performing artists of Chennai come to work there, either do their rehearsals or perform there and so on. So 2 months ago we had hosted a collaborative exhibition between 5 Korean artists and 5 Indian artists. It is an Indo-Korean project. And the theme was water. And since it was right on the beach, the theme of water was quite appropriate. And again, out of these 10 artists, not a single one had sorry, I was recovering from an infection, so I keep coughing in between, please don't mind. None of the artists, oh, thank you. Hi, welcome. Come. You're going to chair. Out of these 10 artists, none of them work with what could be called hard material. It was all technologically created stuff. It had audio elements to it, it had visual elements to it, it had ephemeral elements to it. Some things that just were projected onto trees and onto a water body and stuff like that. So this ephemerality is what strikes you as what is happening now in the realm of new work, as it were. So the question then is, how does then one grade this? Because the response today, if you were to travel this exhibition that is here to Chennai, the response will be very strange. The response will be of an audience that has already gone several steps ahead and seen many different kind of things. So for them this will be something that is of the past. Even though this is very much part of the modernist art movement, already it has gone into the past. You entered an era of postmodernism in art, where the idea, the concept, the thought, the fantasy takes over, and not so much the production itself. And the production is a product of collaboration between several people, like in the Indo-Korean project. One artist from Korea worked with a lights designer, with a sound designer, with someone who was an expert in leather, and so on, and which she herself was not. She herself was not an expert in any of this, but she worked with these multiple other experts to create a piece on which her signature is there, meaning it's her artwork, because it's her idea. So this very, very interesting process is happening, and I just wanted to alert you to the new world that is happening.
Taking this session.
Is the time to dance?
I think that was better.
How many artists who are part of the exhibition are here today? Sadanand is here, who else is here?
So let me introduce you, Preeti Ghosh, Preeti
Oh,
Di,
Preeti, okay.
who is the artist for these two paintings.
Okay.
Then Dhanvanti Nagda, Dhanvanti Ben, the artist for the painting in the corner there. And Dhanashekhar Varla. Nella and Henk, they had a class in Oroville and they'll reach around 5. And I think Perrine has left for France and Lella is in Mexico. Chantal, she was not answering her phone, and so I don't know if she got the information. So I think we have 4. Yes, and me.
Is the AC working? I think he's sweating away.
Sunny. No, he's showing my work
Oh,
in the corner.
Okay. So I just had one response to this. Those of you who go into the history of Indian art will find that the beginnings of what we call modern art in India, we attribute it to this one painter called Raja Ravi Verma and his kinds of work. And Raja Ravi Verma is known for example, his mythological series. You know, he painted the Lakshmis and the Saraswatis and the Ramayana series and so on and so forth. He's known for that kind of work. And taking from the old epics like Kalidasa's Shakuntala and so on and so forth. But just before that, just before he came to do that kind of easel painting, if you see the work of Raja Ravi Verma, as a young artist who was searching for material and searching for ideas and searching for themes to paint, almost all his works of that period were meditative. And you will be surprised that, for example, they resemble something like that. There's a certain sense of going into an inner space and trying to find some kind of a form there, some kind of a form in silence, form in, say, darkness, and so on, and create that form, bring that form out, express it in a particular manner. And
Who is the person you said?
Ravi Verma, Raja Ravi Verma.
He did that yourself.
So we know him as a figurative artist. Anyone you ask about Raja Ravi Verma, even the fellow selling cigarette in BT at the end of the road will have a cutout calendar framed out there, which is from Ravi Verma kind of inspiration. And then as they discovered the easel frame and they began painting on it, then the whole game began to change. And it became more and more in your face rather than meditative. It's no longer internal, but it became external. And this began to inspire a set of artists initially based in Bengal. Famously, the uncle of Rabindranath Tagore, somebody called Gaganendranath Tagore, who is credited with being one of India's most inspiring early artists, modernist artists. And he himself was inspired and cajoled virtually into producing work by a very charismatic Englishman called E.B. Havel, who was actually a Scottish guy, who used to be the principal of the College of Art in Madras. The College of Art in Madras is India's first College of Art, set up in 1850. And I think around the year of 1891, E.B. Havel became the principal of the College of Art in Chennai, those days Madras. And 2 years later, he moved to Calcutta and became the principal of the College of Art in Calcutta and stayed there as principal for 6 years. And during those 6 years, he was extremely influential upon people like Ravindranath Tagore and Abanindranath Tagore and the older Tagores. At that time, Rabindranath Tagore was still very young and he was not painting yet. So it was Abanindranath who began that thing in the family.
Did Ravi Verma also has similar influence?
Ravi Verma's influence was from what is called the company painters, meaning since he came from a royal family, he had access to many royal courts. He could go to Baroda, he could go to Puducherry, he could go to various royal households.
But from outside India? From outside India?
They were all from outside India. So he watched, like if I was the king of Puducherry, I would invite you to come and paint a portrait of mine. And you would come from there, somewhere, France or Germany or UK or somewhere. And Ravi Verma would be there watching this happening. And so he learned the process by watching. He didn't go to school. He learned the painting technique by simply watching other people's paint. And then he adapted it to so-called Indian themes. He did paint a large number of portraits of well-known Indian personalities from royal families from all over India. But then he is much better known for his thematic paintings, like for example the Ramayana series. A very famous painting of Ravana hijacking Sita and cutting off Jatayu's wing. Very, very dramatic, almost melodramatic. You can almost see the beginnings of cinema there. And it's very interesting that when the first cinema happened in 1913, Dada Saheb Phalke's first film called Raja Harishchandra, the backdrops were painted for him by Ravi Verma. So that continuity from the easel into the movie world was very smooth. And that both the visual language and the thematic continuity is very evident when you go into history a little bit there. But E.B. Havel, who I was talking about, was extremely influenced by the beginnings of the Indian freedom movement when A.O. Hume and some other people got together to form the Indian National Congress in 1888, I think. And when the idea of nationalism in India began to grow, E.B. Havel came up with the idea of what he called aesthetic nationalism. He said it's not enough to have just political nationalism and political independence, you must also aesthetic nationalism. And this is what then eventually influenced Abanindranath Tagore to begin to paint a series of works which looked at the Bengal ethos, and this was eventually called the Bengal School. And it's a very influential school. Those who have gone to Shantiniketan, etc. will tell you how strong the impact of the Bengal School was on not just painting, but on poetry, on literature, on how to, the whole visual language changes. Just like I'm saying, today the digital medium is changing our visual language. At that time, the Bengal School suddenly changed the way people looked at society and the environment around. And Abanindranath Tagore painted a very famous painting at that time. I think it was in the year 1899 or 1900 perhaps, which was called Bharat Mata. Many of you might have seen representations of that. It's an image of a kind of a saintly looking woman wearing probably some kind of a Gerua color. Gerua is what the sadhus and sons wear in India. And her head is covered with a white cloth. And this was named, titled Bharat Mata or Mother India. And it's very interesting. For a long time in the ashram here, Bharat Mata was almost seen as a replica of the mother. And there are many people here, Bengali families particularly, who live, whom I used to know earlier, who would always have a portrait of the mother and next to it a print of Abanindranath Tagore's Bharat Mata, because they saw some parallel connection there. And the Bharat Mata image of Abanindranath in turn influenced a series of artists who, particularly from Bengal, to come out and look at what can only be called nativist kind of expression, which ended up with someone like Gemini Roy. And the idea, many people from Shantiniketan then came to College of Art in Madras. For example, one of the most charismatic, the first Indian principal of College of Art in Madras was somebody called Devi Prasad Roy Chaudhary. Very, very famous Indian sculptor. He was a great painter too, but was prominently known as a sculptor. Those of you who have been to Chennai will recognize on Marina Beach those two major sculptures. One is the sculpture of Gandhi, one is Gandhi March, that beautiful motion holding a stick. And the other is called the Triumph of Labour, which is at the end of the beach. So these two iconic sculptures of modern Indian art were created by this person, Devi Prasad Roy Chaudhary. But he came from Shantiniketan and he was a student of Rabindranath Tagore and Nandalal Bose and so on and so forth, and he brought that entire influence to the College of Art in Madras. And this idea of working with what could be called native themes, what could be called indigenous themes, kind of began to spread like wildfire. And roughly from the period 1954, you will find a series of artists from Madras, for example, starting with say K.C.S. Panikar and K.V. Haridasan and Akitam Narayanan and Vishwanathan, Nandagopal, and a series of artists who got tremendously influenced by an Indian visual symbolic form called Tantra. And Tantra being a kind of high spiritual quest, meditative quest, through the visual language. It was not just meditation through the mind, but it was also meditation through color and form and a kind of visual symbolic sensibility. And this was called indigenist return to local material and local themes and local inspiration. And certainly in the Madras school, this is very, very popular. And from Madras school, because of certain kind of influences, it traveled towards Bombay and caught on in the JJ School of Art in Bombay, which is another major art school in India at that time, even today. And that produced people like G.R. Santosh and Biren Dey and very, very important artists who eventually created what is called the abstractionist school in India. So now, for example, these are all very abstract works, and your provenance, if you want to call it, your ancestors were, you can trace them back to Raja Ravivarma. That whole, this whole school of art comes from that. It's about 120 years old, and it's fascinating.
But sir, just to interrupt, Ravi Varma's abstraction paintings, I can't even see a single one in front of my eyes.
Absolutely, that's the whole point. So
I don't even have any trace of any abstraction from him.
I'm glad you mentioned it, because that also shows the, what you can call the black holes in Indian art history. We will take what we want to see and we abandon what we don't want to see. So
they were not projected.
Well, we don't have anyone who's done. We call Raja Ravivarma the father of Indian modernism, if you want to call it that. There are altogether just 3 books on him. Only 3 books on him, which is completely unacceptable in a country with so many thousands of important artists and art schools and art practices and galleries and so on. Only 3 solid works on Raja Ravivarma.
But his abstraction is never spoken about.
It's there in one book, it's there in one, tucked away in one corner. Yeah, he did also that kind of thing. But the projection was for all the other kind of
Maybe that
figurative
didn't
work.
sell with the British, so he wasn't.
No, it's got nothing to do with selling. The point is, he did it, and we are looking at that work, let's say now, 120 years later. It's up to us to assess that work. We can't be saying, okay, British didn't like it, so we are also not going to like it. We can't do that. So it's a problem of, I think, what is going on in the art schools in the country. It's a problem with the way art history is being constructed and worked upon. And these are the kind of holes you will find. You will find many holes where I mean, just take Shantiniketan itself, you will find again and again and again 7 or 8 artists are spoken about, but 8 or 9 other important artists are not spoken about. If you take the Baroda College of Art, you will find 15 artists are spoken about, but 6 artists are not spoken about. So why is that not spoken about happening? Because
How do you explain?
How do you explain that?
You as a critic and historian, how do you explain?
I'm saying that it's a problem of art history. I mean, I can in that sense criticize my own breed. I mean, I'm not a professional art historian, but there are very many important professional art historians in India. But they pick and choose whom they like. So it's, for example, I can walk into this gallery and I can say, I like this very much, and then write only about this. And that means everybody else becomes invisible and only this gets projected. So the invisibility happens in these kind of ways. Whereas a serious art historian or a writer would contextualize a work I like very much along with the other works, etc., etc. So that activity somehow hasn't happened in India enough. And therefore even such an important thing like Ravi Verma's abstract period simply falls through the gap in art history.
But those prints exist somewhere, we see.
And there are no prints of it, meaning the paintings were there, and some of them are gone, and some of them have been, there are people have discovered it, somebody that taken loft, and some photographs have been taken, and like I said, in one book there is a reference to this. And they're quite amazing, the kind of paintings, the initial paintings of But also history also plays a trick. The fact that Ravi Verma was doing this at a time when Indian nationalism was growing, so this idea of India was growing, and some of his works became very popular because the printing press arrived in India almost around that time. Color printing press. Where was it happening? It was happening very close to Puducherry, this place called Shivakashi, which is the capital for creating fireworks, for creating cheap posters, and one more thing. What is that? Shivakashi is the
calendars.
Huh?
Calendars.
Calendar, yeah, that is the one. That's printing.
Printing.
That's printing. Printing, fireworks, and one mobile, child labor is employed a lot, and etc. etc. Anyway, so Shivakashi became the cheapest printing center in India, and all these works that Ravi Verma was creating were copied and taken to Shivakashi and made into oleographs or calendars, like he's saying, and they spread all over. He painted one painting, but the printing press can make 100,000 copies of it. So it's spread all over, and then I see this lovely image of Lakshmi or Durga or Saraswati, and I say, oh my God, this is very sacred for me. I take it, I put a frame on it and put it in my puja room. So this became popular. Ravi Verma got known for this, not for anything else. So it's only recently that some art historians are even discovering that he had another aspect. People were not even interested probably. So for me, this is a particular drawback of the way art history is taught in art schools and art colleges in India. We have currently in India about 32 art colleges in different parts of the country. About 5 of them are very well known, very big and very well known, like Madras College of Art and Baroda College of Art and Shantiniketan and Delhi College of Art and JJ School of Art. Others are smaller colleges or departments of art in various colleges. But out of this 34, there are only 4 colleges that have a course in art history. So that again is a very, very problematic area. You won't find this anywhere in Europe. Any art college that is set up will also simultaneously have a course in art history, because that's very important to know how to evaluate, how to assess, and how to go forward. So, in Baroda College of Art, for example, there's a very, very good art history department. So typically what happens is that if I'm a student of painting and if he's a student of sculpture, he's a student of art history, we are all in the same year together, first year or second year or third year, we stay together in the hostel. So when I do my painting and he does his sculpture and he does his theoretical work, in the evening we discuss it. So there is a certain exchange that happens. And my insights in painting help him as a writer, and his insights in art theory help him as a sculptor, and so on. And so it's a wonderful exchange. And by the time I pass out of the college in 5 years, and I do my first exhibition, I already have a friend or a colleague or someone who understands my work, who can write the review and write intelligently about my work. So therefore, students from the Baroda College of Art have a march over many other artists from other colleges in India. And Chennai, for example, in Madras College of Art, there is no art history department. And therefore, those students and those artists are hardly written about. We don't have in Chennai art historian or an art writer worth her or his salt. And therefore, many of those people and many of those very, very good artists are not even written about, not even discussed. And since the system in India is such that writers from the north hardly come to the south to look at work here, these artists become invisible. And then suddenly one fine day, as a curator, supposing I take 5 artists and take an exhibition to Delhi, then everybody says, oh my God, where have you been hiding these people? We never knew that they existed, and so on and so forth. So this is a very uneven playing field at the moment, and that's creating a lot of bumps. But you're responding to that ideal. And that's a very mystical space, because it's a universal mother then who's creating the universe and creating the life force and so on. That mystical source is an old source in Indian art. It is as old as about, in modern art it will take at least 120 years, and even today that source continues. So recently I saw a fabulous exhibition in Bangalore of an artist who teaches in the Visakhapatnam College of Art in Andhra Pradesh. His name is V. Ramesh. I don't know if you've heard of him, but V. Ramesh is one of the foremost Indian artists who works today with mystical themes or metaphysical themes. And he takes inspiration from poetry of people who, you must be familiar with this word called renunciate, people who renounce life, people who renounce the normal life and go away somewhere, go away to a forest and do some meditation, or go away to a lonely spot to do some meditation, and then come back with some kind of insight or some kind of enlightenment, if you want to call it, and then they speak or sing or write. So he has taken 4 poets from 4 different eras and geographies. So one is called Karaikal Amma from this part of the country towards Tanjore, who was a 5th century renunciate, a woman who left her house, who left her family, who left her husband and children and just vanished, and then came back and wandered about naked, just singing, and verses of very high philosophy, which are all now part of Tamil literature, very high literature. And her whole theme was, this body is a useless body, and I want to renounce my body. I want my body to evaporate. I want my body to disintegrate. I just want the spirit to shine. So this was a constant theme. And so when Ramesh picks up Karaikal Amma's figure, he tries to work around this theme of evanescence and impermanence and so on, so kind of things. Then he takes somebody called Manikavajakar, who actually comes from the Karnataka region. He's a 12th century mendicant saint. Same thing, man who at the age of 12 or so runs away from home and goes and seeks somebody, some guru who can teach him something, and slowly picks up ideas and then eventually emerges as a very, very important philosopher saint of this region. Then a 14th century renunciate from Kashmir called Lal Ded, absolutely brilliant poet saint who nobody knows whether she was Hindu or Muslim. She simply did not care for that kind of an identity. In fact, people are not even sure whether she was man or woman. So because she kind of erased the idea of those kind of specific identities and became more universal, and has written some outstanding poetry which is available till now only in Kashmiri language. But just last 2 years ago, one of India's leading young poets and critics called Ranjit Hoskote, who also writes extensively on the arts, he has translated all those poems from Kashmiri to English, and they are, it's an eye-opener. You never realized that in the 14th century you had such a radical and firebrand kind of poet amidst us. Then he's taken the figure of Ramana Maharshi, again very close to the Puducherry in Tiruvannamalai. Ramana Maharshi again, who left home at the age of 16 or 17 and never went back. And totally quiet, he didn't have anything particular to teach anybody. But the kind of life he led, the life of the renunciation. So these are all like rebel figures, people who reject society, who say your society is all completely screwed up and we don't want to be in society. There is something all going wrong here. So let us find another truth. And they withdraw and they go back. And they probably find some truth, we don't know, but their personalities become very powerful. And their personalities become very attractive, just like, for example, Sri Aurobindo or the mother and so on. There's an attraction there which you can't easily explain. But it's an attraction that stems from that stepping out of the convention, stepping out of the acceptable, stepping out of the comfort zone and so on. And so this artist, V. Ramesh, is again one such person who's fallen through the gap of Indian art history. No Indian art historian has written about him. He's maybe about 60, 62 years old. But you see his work and you'll be astonished at the depth and the sheer mystical power in each of big canvases. He makes 6 feet by 12 feet and so on. So the National Gallery of Modern Art in Bangalore, there was this major retrospective of his work. And you could see the art world of Bangalore getting entirely astonished. They could not believe that that kind of an artist was living and practicing and doing things, but we don't know about him. We are students of art. We are students of art history, but we don't know about anything about him. It seems like out of the blue, some complete stranger has landed and is showing the work. So these kind of things are happening a lot in India. The film I'm going to show you about Dashrath Patel is somewhat like that. Dashrath is, I curated his retrospective exhibition in 1998 for the National Gallery of Modern Art in Delhi, and next year for the NGMA in Bombay. And I call it a counter-historical exhibition because art history has not acknowledged it. It's just fascinating that he studied in the College of Art in Chennai, graduated from there. He went to École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, graduated there from with distinction. He went to Professor Eckert in Czechoslovakia and learned ceramic. Henri Cartier-Bresson was his guru in photography, and so on. Year after year he was getting new teachers, learning new things, and then eventually in 1961 he sets up the National Institute of Design in Ahmedabad and sets up all the departments there, from ceramic to photography to exhibition design to textile and so on. He's a master in all these forms. But soon after he returned to India from doing his masters in Paris, there used to be this fascinating center in Bombay. I don't know why that idea has never got replicated. It's called the Bholabhai Desai Center. It doesn't exist anymore. But the Bholabhai Desai Center, right in the middle of Bombay, Warden Road, was a huge building, tall, big multi-story building, which had 24 studio rooms for 24 artists, out of which about probably 18 were visual artists, they were painters and sculptors and so on, and the rest was poets and musicians and dancers and so on. So, can you imagine, in one building at that time there was M.F. Hussain, there was Syed Haider Raza.
Was that a group of progressive artists?
No, progressive artists only a group of 6 artists.
Visual?
Yes.
And they set up in 1949. And they announced themselves as progressive.
Is that the group which moved from Madras?
No. They were all Bombay based. So basically that was Francis Newton Souza, M.M. Hussain, Raza, J. Swaminathan. They called themselves a progressive artist. Madras had, and they called them Progressive Artist Group. Madras had earlier, in 1944, started something called the Progressive Artist Association, which had K.C.S. Panikkar and Pradosh Dasgupta and various all of them. Yeah. So Cholamandal started in the 60s, but they set up in 1944 itself. So 49, the Progressive Artist Group happened in Bombay, but this Bholabhai Desai Center comes up in 1954.
By whom was it initially?
A philanthropist, if you want to call it. Bholabhai Desai was a very, very famous Indian lawyer, extremely important Indian lawyer, the man who fought the case of Sardar Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh was sent to the gallows, and it was Bholabhai Desai who fought for him and almost won the case. And Bholabhai Desai died, and there was a trust formed in his memory, and his wife Madhuri Desai was running this whole thing. And another very important lawyer called Soli Batliwala was the main trustee who was running this thing. So there are these 24 studios where 20 of India's topmost artists were living and working. Topmost then, topmost today. So imagine these names. If you are students of art, you will probably understand this. Hussain, Gaitonde, Raza, Tayyab Mehta, Prafulla Dhanukar, Nasreen Mohammadi, Jatin Das, Dashrath Patel, and throw into that Yamini Krishnamurti, and so this was the kind of mix that was there. And this was the time prior to, economics in Indian art. Nothing was selling. You couldn't sell art, really speaking. The highest price anybody would buy something was maybe 200 rupees, or with some bargaining 250 perhaps, and so on. So that was a kind of market, within quotation, market for art at that time. So these people used to live and work there, and they were all rooms like this. Each one had a room like this. There was a lovely skylight kind of arrangement, so nice natural light could come in. You could do your work there. Every Saturday, Mr. Soli Batliwala organized a party for 6 of the rich, important people in Bombay. And at this party, this artist would be also asked to come and join the table. After the dinner is over, it was a job of Mr. Soli Batliwala to take these 6 rich people, one by one, to each studio. And he'll say, look, this is the work of M.F. Hussain. So M.F. Hussain was then a jobless man, meaning nobody was buying his paintings. So to earn a living, he was doing film hoardings. Dilip Kumar, Nargis, all that huge film hoardings on Regal Theatre. That was the way he earned some money. So, but he had already learned some kind of human psychology. So he would look at the person's face who had come in, and he'd know, no, these guys are not interested in my work. They were looking like this. They said, he's not interested in my work. So he will shout to the next studio, studio number 2, get ready, they're coming. So the whole group will be taken to studio number 2. And until one painting was bought, these people were never left. So one of these 6 had to buy. And eventually one painting would be bought. So imagine 250 rupees. And there will be a massive celebration. The next day morning, with those 250 rupees, they would settle the bills of the Irani tea shop downstairs. They would settle their laundry bills. Everything was on credit. And finally, with the whatever 50 rupees left, they'll all get into 2, 3, 4 taxis and go to Regal Theatre, which was nearby, and watch a film sitting in air-conditioned comfort and go up that way. But this was the kind of cooperative feeling that was there among artists at that time. It's amazing that we don't have a single space like that in India anymore, where the community of artists can live and work together. Cholamandal comes a little bit close to that, but still it's not the same.
They have a little Orville.
Yeah.
She's part of her community.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's happening, it's great.
Not like that.
But what's happening is the idea of market and commerce has divided the art world. So everybody is split into what am I going to get out of it, what I'm going to get out of it. So Dashrath Patel, for example, was part of that group. But you will find art historians will mention that moment and that building and that whole experience. And they'll talk about Hussain, they'll talk about Razza, and they'll talk about Tayyar Mehta, and they'll talk about 3-4 names like Gayatri and so on. But there'll be total silence about Dashrath Patel. So with the result that...
so what's the reason behind, according to you, that he wasn't taken in?
Because at one point he moved away from, let's say, hardcore art, if you want to call it, to design. He started the NID, and it was like, okay, then you left our community, we don't want to anymore. So that kind of division between art and design, or art and ceramic, or art and photography, today it's coming back, it's all coming back together. But here was a man who was encompassing all that at one time, and yet art historians didn't recognize that. And that's the sadness of the whole situation. So there are many such stories about artists and art movements in India which haven't been acknowledged enough or written about enough or understood enough.
So maybe Puducherry is one of those movements.
I think so. You have to produce an art historian from here. It's not just enough to have an exhibition. You need to be able to have people who can also express what it's all about.
I'm just wondering how we will steer with the time we have.
Yeah.
So, what I was wondering is maybe, I think some people have some queries to ask you.
Yeah, sure.
How should we go about it?
I'm easy because it's a very informal group and nice to feel the sense of informality. So we can have some questions. Do you want to break for some chat?
But that is after 15 minutes, then we have the screening, because there will be like at 5:30 we kind of stop this session and then have the next session at 5:45. So for 15 minutes we could have a
certainly.
Is that one? Like what I wanted initially, what I had in mind initially, what made me invite Sadanand was, I felt that there was a lack of an objective viewer or a critical viewer in Puducherry, and I felt that kind of a voice was very necessary. That's why I was very keen that you come. And as you said that you have to produce an art critique from here to make your art known. So what I'd like to ask you as a historian or a critique, like doesn't a work by itself have a power of its own? Is it only when a critique comes and says it's good that it is recognized as good? Like can't the work on its own stand as a good work of art? It doesn't need the stilts of a critique, does it?
It's a very good question, but the only way one can answer that is art by itself is actually absolutely nothing. Means nothing. Unless it enters a realm called discourse. There has to be discourse on it. Only then it becomes art. Otherwise, it is just something I've done in some mood or whatever, and it can stay inside my house. But when it comes in a public space and I see it and you see it and she says it and we say something about the red is interesting or the green is interesting, whatever, then a discourse begins. What do you mean by interesting? Why is it interesting? What is that space all about? How has it broken his foreground and background and so on? Then the idea of art emerges, that there is a thought behind it, there is a skill behind it, there is a language to it, etc. etc. But by itself, no. You can make a great masterpiece and keep it going. You may think it's a masterpiece, but the world need not necessarily look at it like that.
And also a body of work counts. Now it's important to have a body and not just one single piece of
Possibly, but that's again, you can make this one great extraordinary piece. Oh, Henry's great story from the last leaf.
and then produce nothing called and still.
I mean, those kind of people have also happened. John Osborne, this great writer, looked back in anger, the one book he wrote, and he never wrote a book again. But that one book made him both a millionaire and one of the most talked about authors of his time. Even today we talk about him, even though we know more. But this is very important. So the need to create discourse, which means how to up the ante for also the viewer. What am I watching? What am I looking at? I'm looking at the work. What am I looking at? Am I looking at so if I say, oh, it's lovely, what does it mean? What does the word lovely mean? Because it's a great work. What does the word great mean? What are the parameters for what you say? And that critical engagement which produces the discourse is very important, not just for the artist. The artist has to listen to it, the artist has to hear it, but also for the viewer. So great art can happen only when there's a community of great viewers. It cannot happen minus that. And
So can I ask you to be that viewer and to give a dialogue on the show or on some works that have, can you kind of just speak something about, more particularly, means it may be of every artist, whatever works you just feel you might think
React to.
No, see, that's one of the reasons why I contextualized it within the provenance of
yes.
so-called mystical paintings in India, and that whatever you're seeing here is in fact right within that journey.
So actually,
you have to see yourself like that. Now, once I've said that, then I take, supposing I go right back and take Ravi Verma's any one painting, supposing I take Shakuntala, and I juxtapose this against that. Or I take Abanindranath Tagore's Bharat Mata and juxtapose that against that. Then I find that the person who started the trend in 1899, that far back, 120 years ago, was far, far ahead than what we are doing now. And then we need to question, so why is it like that? Why am I not ahead of the person who started this whole
Yeah,
thing?
but when you say it's far ahead,
What do you mean?
on what criteria?
Yeah, so that criteria may be my own criteria, which I can explain in a, how do you say, more elaborate. If there was a PowerPoint projection, I could show and point and all that. But if you're considering me some kind of an art historian, then you do also acknowledge that I'm saying it in a considered way. That I would rate Abanindranath's Bharat Mata as an extraordinary work of art produced in the 19th century, and in the 21st century, when I look at this, I say, hey, Abanindranath was already there. So what it means is, today's artists, supposing you are the one who painted this, I would say you are living in an amnesiac state. You are in amnesia. You have forgotten your past. You don't know your past. You don't know your roots. You don't know who the artists were before you. You don't know what they were doing. If you don't know that, then it's high time you caught up. If you did this in chemistry, you'll be drummed out of the chemistry business. If you did this in physics, it's a get lost. Know your past and know what the scientists have done before, and so on.
Can I say something?
So I'm not saying it in a harsh way, but I'm saying this is where the problems of engaging with art begin. So one is, I can say I'm an amateur, I don't care about history, I felt like doing it, I did it. Okay, that's acceptable, completely acceptable. But when the evaluation comes, when you ask this question, how to evaluate it, then someone like me will have to be brutally honest and say, look, there are gaps in the business. Yes.
Does this also apply to the paintings which are for the inner journey? Like you said that the work that artists do when they go inside and they want to show that outside through painting or through color or canvas. Maybe you can't put this statement to that kind of art.
No, so the question always is this, then, how personal is the work?
Yeah. Can it even be compared?
Yeah, so I have done this work and I say I'm completely satisfied. I was in a particular mood, and and purple came to me, and gold came to me, and these forms came to me, and I did it. And that mood has been satisfied.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is the kind of what is called primitive expression. For example, Janine did a lot of work with fishermen's children and Dalit children and marginalized children, and actually giving them paper and paint and crayons to work with. And it was fascinating because you saw a whole universe of inner psychology coming out. Their fears, their dreams, their sense of right and wrong, whatever. Their joys, all that was being put on paper. But then when you apply evaluation standards from artistic perception, there's a different activity altogether. So you need to be able to separate that element. So there is today a whole community of people who are doing art as therapy. And then this comes out. You can do the Rorschach method, various things. You can do art as therapy. I may have some kind of a phobia, and that phobia gets silenced or neutralized when I work with, say, red paint, or when I work with circular forms, whatever calms me down. Yes, but would you call that art?
Can you put it there and say that?
So intentionality is very important. Intentionality is very important. When Picasso painted Guernica, was he doing that, or was he doing something else? These questions are very important.
So would you like to comment on a few works here, and then maybe some people might want to ask you some questions?
Yeah, well, this is my comment. I've said generally.
Okay. So actually, I think there are three kinds of worlds in Puducherry. Everyone is not in that one mystical journey.
Sure.
I'd like to tell you.
Yeah.
So the oracle is kind of a niche more in the nature, and ashram is more private and individual living, and then there are a lot of local artists like you see. I think so. I have just put them under one roof, and they might be very diverse. What do you feel? The works, do they hold?
If you are doing it, then you will be called the curator of the work.
Yeah, I just housed it under one roof.
Curator of the exhibition, and so there will be. If I were looking at it from outside, I will say there is a curatorial flaw.
Yes.
When you bring these three worlds together.
Right.
Now, I don't know how watertight these compartments are. Auroville, ashram, non-ashram, non-auroville. How watertight they are, I'm not sure. But if you're going to put them together, then you must know why you're doing it and what you wanted to bring.
So actually, they're kind of quite, I will not say watertight, but they're three worlds.
But there is a flow between them.
And there is an interaction, but it is kind of quite, others can say what they
The search is
about
different.
it.
The search is different.
Yeah. And what made me put it under one roof was, I felt the need to create bridges between these three worlds, firstly, because we live in one city.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think there's interesting work happening in all the three worlds. Maybe they don't curatorially actually really bunch up together. But when we look at the different art movements that have happened till now, be it the progressive or be it, there have been, like you spoke about Nasreen and Raza. You spoke about Hussein so they have, if you see their works, there's nothing actually common. It's as different as this and this. When you look at Nasreen and Hussein, it's just that they were in one city and they were working together and they grew up together. So, I mean,
but it's also interesting that nobody has ever exhibited Nasreen and Raza together. They have never come together in the same gallery space. So those provenances are different.
Right.
And, therefore, once again, someone like Nasreen, and so this is an extraordinary story. This lady that she's talking about, Nasreen Mohammadi, passed away somewhere around 2000 or 2002 or something. And fairly young, she was in her early 60s maybe. Extraordinary gifted artist, very, very abstract mind. And everybody knew her for being a master of the line. She used to do this stupendously complex black and white graphics, painstaking, meditative, very deep kind of thing. But last November, there was an exhibition in Delhi at the Art Gallery, Art Gallery, of Nasreen Mohammadi's photographs, never before seen. And the entire art world took a somersault because she is far ahead of photography practice by the rest of the well-known photographers in India. And we didn't even know that she was photography. So a lot of these hidden things are there. Because someone is not being projected in the right way, or the art world is not absorbing them in the right way, many things get left out. And then after several years, so this is now 13 years after she passed away, everybody suddenly discovering Nasreen Mohammadi.
So who dug up the photo? Like
one curator, one very interesting.
so
young
the
girl.
role of the curator and the historian.
There was a young girl who wanted to write something about her and investigate it and hit upon this jackpot. So for example, taking a literary example, supposing I were to work with the sonnet form. The sonnet has existed since Chaucer and Shakespeare and this and that, and they are considered masters of it, and until you come to Wordsworth and Shelley, and the sonnet becomes fantastic and Keats and all that. And today I work with the sonnet form. If you were in the world of literature, there is no way that if you are working sonnet, you will not be compared to those people who went there well before you. And then it may be easy for me to say, you are not a John Keats. So then you can say, no, but why do I do John? Maybe I become a John Keats, maybe I do better than him, etc. But the point is, you have to know that a genre has had a flow. And where are you within that flow is very important. So for example, someone like Vikram Seth comes along, and in his very first literary work, he creates that thing called Golden Gate, which is the sonnet redefined, meaning he takes the iambic pentameter, he just takes a meter and he redefines. So then the sonnet gets modernized, it gets restated, and suddenly it becomes an important work. So this is what I mean. If you know what has gone before, then it's a great strength, because you can then work in a manner which you yourself will discover a new thing. You yourself will discover something in that whole thing. So there is an artist in Bangalore who is working, for example, with the inspiration from Ravi Verma, but not the figurations of Ravi Verma, but what are called the negative spaces. Like for example, in a work like this, this is a positive space, yeah? It's a figure, it's a positive space. Now this is a negative space. This is a positive space. This is a negative space. This is a negative space. Those negative spaces, this artist studied very deeply and is seeing meaning and value in it. There is some very interesting sense of harmony and balance in the way negative space emerges in Ravi Verma's work. And then she's kind of beginning to focus just on that. But that will be restating Ravi Verma in a completely new way. And those who are then connoisseurs will look up and say, look, something new is emerging and so on. But for that you have to know your Ravi Verma, you have to know that lineage, as it's called. So one of the problems of the internet generation is that you parachute down into time wherever you are. And there is no past and there is no future and everything is the present. And that's often damaging for a certain kind of deep artwork. You may produce brilliant new things, but depth may not be there.
But aren't the young people today being exposed to different images that we were exposed to? And aren't they seeing differently?
It's a good question. I mean, that was asked, and that's almost the same thing that I'm saying, what she's saying.
Sorry, I didn't get the point. What did she say?
She's saying in her time there was certain exposure to lots of different kinds of periods and times and works and so on. So her question is, are young people today getting that kind of exposure? My answer would be no, they are not.
What's your answer?
My answer is no, they are not.
Oh, we're not, our ability to see is not different.
No, the ability to see is the same. In fact, it's much more today because all our eyeballs are getting trained to speed. We're watching so much internet screen and television screen and traffic on the road that we are seeing much more. However, what we're getting exposed to is very little.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
And so digital art, it seems to me, is some people see it in a different way. I mean, are more related to it than, say, I would be.
Right.
But it doesn't mean to me that it's better or worse.
Sure.
It's just different. And it's historically different, is it not?
No, I agree completely. I'm just saying in the objective art world today, the way it is, so in this room we can all say that this is fantastic work. But in the objective art world, which is to do with evaluation and good and bad, and what is worth showing, what is not worth showing, what is worth buying, what is not worth buying, etc., etc., there will be certain yardsticks at play. And in those yardsticks, some of these trends take over. So if you are a person who's saying, I don't want to work with digital, I want to work with my canvas, I want to do quiet work, produce one painting in 3 months or whatever, then you will remain in that quiet place. The art world will bypass you. So that's a problem. I don't acknowledge that as the right practice, but I'm saying that is a practice at the moment. So people who are doing quiet work, they don't look at, like the example of V. Ramesh that I was talking about. He is sitting in Visakhapatnam, which is not part of any mainstream Indian city. It's a small coastal city in Andhra Pradesh. And he teaches in a college there, and nobody even looks at him. No art critic goes to him, no art buyer goes to him, no art gallery goes to him. He's just sitting.
And I guess if he's fine by it, it doesn't matter, like, he's okay with it. If
No,
it's the art world that's really missing out, and if the art world knows well enough, it should reach out to him and get it.
Of course it is fine by him, but the question is, should it be fine by us? That's a question. If you have such a fantastic master sitting in a corner, unacknowledged, unseen, unengaged with, should it be fine by you?
Preeti has to take her leave, so she's just excusing herself. She has to go.
Yeah, sure. You want to say something before you leave?
Would you like to read this out for
Santosh.
No,
Santosh.
No, it's from. This is just a sentence from Shiomen.
That's okay, we read it. We don't want quotations.
No, it has got to do with the discussion about the youth and what the times are. It's very pertinent to the discussion.
How did you start working with that? Did you learn formally or how did it happen?
No, we were educated right from childhood. Whatever we imbibed from the atmosphere, especially from mother,
Yeah.
and whatever she told us to do, don't try to copy nature blindly.
Yeah.
Try to paint whatever comes from within. And then her limbs, whenever we took any painting to her, her comments were very, very valuable. And it helped us to go forward.
So that's the whole point. She was an art critic right here. We need more such people who will engage with the product that's happening. Thank you very much.
Would you like to say something? Because I think in 5 minutes, I'm sorry we have to wind this session, okay? Otherwise we won't be in time for our next training. I'd also like to introduce you to Hank. the sculptor.
Oh yeah.
He's Hank. So maybe Hank, you would also, after Dhanvanti man, maybe like to say something. And Neela. So if you have something to say. Hank, would you like to say something?
Sorry?
Would you like to say something in the context of the...
I'm not sure I can speak.
This happens with many artists. But beautiful work,
And my hearing is a little bit bad.
Okay.
And also my English is not perfect. So I have some difficulties.
You work with stone and steel. What is the material? Evaporated. So wood also? Very interesting.
She's having a sore throat, so she'll talk to you later.
Okay.
But I think there's a video, no?
Sorry?
You make a video.
Yeah.
So I can look
You can hear that, yeah.
Yes.
Sure.
And there is a thin line that runs through a curator, the art teacher, the art critic, and art historian. So where do you draw the line of division, and how do the roles become specific? At what stage? And how does the society progress, depending on the dynamics of the situation from one city to the other? So for a country like India, I'm pretty shocked that we only have 4 colleges in India who has art history classes.
So, I mean, art historian is what that word says he or she is, meaning someone who's looking at periods and someone who's putting in perspective exactly what happened during those periods and seeing the connection between the periods. Now, there is one style of art history which is called decadal, meaning supposing you say what happened in 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, so you go decade by decade. It's one kind of art history. Another kind of art history is going by schools. So a school in the late 19th century, a school in the early 20th century, a school in the 1930s or 40s. Different schools that emerge, different ideas and thoughts. Like the progressive artists and radical artists and various terminologies like that. Then the historian creates perspective. The historian creates the idea of where something begins and where it's going. And that's very important. It gives you the context of where to place different productions in art. A curator, on the other hand, may not even need to know history. A curator can be completely free and completely imaginative. And like for example, Kirti has done, that I want to put together 3 different streams of activity going on here and see what happens. So the curator's work can be a lesson to the art historian. Sometimes the art historian can look at, there's a fantastic exhibition going on in Delhi at the National Museum. If anybody's traveling to Delhi, please don't miss seeing that. It's on till July or August. It's called The Body in Indian Art. B-O-D-Y, Body in Indian Art. And it's curated by a person called Naman Ahuja, who's an art historian teaching at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And he's taken representations of the Indian body, he's categorized them in 5 types. So the physical body, the abstract body, the idea of body as a receiver of pain, the idea of body as a receiver of ecstasy, and the idea of body as transcendence. So he's taken these 5 ideas of the body and taken representations from Indian painting, folk art, sculpture, contemporary art, a broad range of things from museums and galleries in India plus from abroad. So some fantastic Vishnu who's sitting in Canberra Museum, some fantastic Bodhisattva that is in Tibet, and he just brought together all these things. And it's a huge exhibition, it's an absolutely eye-opening exhibition on the concept, different concepts of the body. Of course, he's an art historian and he's done this. But for me, when I go and see that work, it's like an education. It's like you get to see an entirely new way of understanding figurative representation. So if this work, for example, if it goes into that exhibition, where will you place it? Is it figuration? Is it body as void? Is it transcendence? Is it pain? Is it text? You see? In what category will you place it, etc. So those kind of questions begin to arise. And it's a masterly job of indicating all this. And then in various Indian, if you want, religious traditions or spiritual traditions, how the body has been seen, how it has been represented. Why is it that we just take one stone and put it somewhere and we call it a Shivaling, or whatever. This whole idea of abstraction of the body is worked it out in a fantastic scale. So now that's an act of curation. The curator can transcend history and transcend time and geography and go to different places. So that also you need more this kind of imaginative curating exercises.
Do you feel the advent of computers has in any way diluted the basic skill of the artist?
I don't know, I think it's a new skill, that's all one can say. It's a new skill. I mean, there is no rule that says art is only about drawing with a pencil or a pen or a brush or no rule like that. Art can be any particular kind of expression. If you're able to do it with a computer, then why not? Because you're now in a world where you can't necessarily deny the computer. Willy-nilly it's affecting our lives. I can say I will not have a computer, I will not sit next to opposite it and all that, but everybody else is around you is doing it. The whole world is arranging itself around that. So you can't run away. So it will be cynical to move away from it. I think it's more positive to accept what is there and work with that. The digital format, this whole thing is being shot on digital format. 10 years ago this was not possible. You needed a big, massive camera to do it. This Canon D5 was changed. She's sitting there with all that equipment next to you. You can't run away from it. It's all around you. You're surrounded by technology. So then it's important to acknowledge it and then to say how you can turn it. If it's a mechanical device, how to make it more human, how to make it more responsive, how to make it more creative and so on.
One question. So what is, in your opinion, role of pure art today? By pure art, I mean pure sculpture, pure painting, pure mediums.
I mean, the role is the same.
I mean, do they stand in the postmodern world? Do they?
It doesn't. The role is the same role.
Yeah.
It's just that
how
pure is it?
I mean, just canvas, paint on canvas.
Everybody's doing it.
Yeah. No, a lot of multimedia, digital thing. You're saying if you don't accept.
No, I'm not saying you don't accept. I'm saying, see, I was talking about the context of art.
Yeah.
So, as a curator, for example, you have decided to display canvases and sculpture. At a time when most curators, 99 other curators will be accepting only digital work or only some kind of audio kind of work and so on.
So, as a curator, I'd like to ask you that, I feel there's very little also true criticism happening today. And good curatorial works, are they happening in your opinion? I feel that today sometimes that's why the curator has become more important than the artist, if I may say. Would you agree?
Curator has taken over today.
Has taken over the artist.
They are the trendsetters.
They are the trendsetters.
It's like the director of a film who's more important than the actor.
Yeah, but it's also determined by the, how do you say, the power of the market. Because the idea of the old solo show somehow does not hold water anymore. We have not had a big solo show by no single contemporary artist in a long time. So almost everything has become group shows. And therefore, the moment you have a group show, a curator comes in the picture.
I think solo shows happen posthumously because artists can't keep so much work, they keep selling at every stage,
That of course.
they can't store.
That of course.
I mean, I think those are the reasons. They can't collect so much work at a time to have a solo show.
But I mean, why is this work next to that work? What is the logic of these three works of art being next to each other? These are all the jobs of the curator to think about.
So I divided the half into half, kind of abstract and figurative, and big formats and small formats. By and large, I was not given much of a curatorial choice to tell you, but I just, that's how I put it in this space.
Yeah, so my comment would be that's very simplistic.
It is.
So therefore, how to make the idea complex? You can have
more conceptual intervention. And frankly, I just kind of, on a very short notice, invited the artists who accepted. So I think maybe a sequel to this will be when it will be more better conceptualized.
That's the way to do it. Just use the question.
But I'm sorry, because I think we did that. You remember when we inaugurated the show and we came, you said, oh, say something. And actually none of us spoke about the work because we said, mostly we spoke about the fact that you brought us all together, which can in itself have its expression or its need. And because our particular situation is here that we all work, or we tend to work a little bit in our niche. And unless we go to shows here and there, we do our show, but that not necessarily brings it together. So between Pondi, Auroville, and inside Pondi, also the various groups, it helps us to start just a discussion, which we in fact need in this place. So I'm often with Kirti in a talk where we need to come together and exchange, which will exactly, maybe. So in this sense, your talk here could also serve a little bit like a wake-up call or something of the sort, which I very much welcome, in fact.
That's what's meant by discourse.
Yes.
But I mean, why is this work next to that work? What is the logic of these three works of art being next to each other? These are all the jobs of the curator to think about.
So I divided the half into half, kind of abstract and figurative, and big formats and small formats. By and large, I was not given much of a curatorial choice to tell you, but I just, that's how I put it in this space.
So my comment would be that's very simplistic.
It is.
So therefore, how to make the idea complex? You can have
more conceptual intervention. And frankly, I just kind of, on a very short notice, invited the artists who accepted. So I think maybe a sequel to this will be when it will be more better conceptualized.
That's the way to do it. Just use the question.
But I'm sorry, because I think we did that. You remember when we inaugurated the show and we came, you said, oh, say something. And actually none of us spoke about the work because we said, mostly we spoke about the fact that you brought us all together, which can in itself have its expression or its need. And because our particular situation is here that we all work, or we tend to work a little bit in our niche. And unless we go to shows here and there, we do our show, but that not necessarily brings it together. So between Pondi, Auroville, and inside Pondi, also the various groups, it helps us to start just a discussion, which we in fact need in this place. So I'm often with Kirti in a talk where we need to come together and exchange, which will exactly, maybe. So in this sense, your talk here could also serve a little bit like a wake-up call or something of the sort, which I very much welcome.